Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Professor Russell Goldborn. I'm a professor of French literature and the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities here at King's London. It's very good to welcome you all this evening. It gives me great pleasure to say just a few words before we start properly. The first event in this year's Arts and Humanities Festival, organised by the Faculty's Arts and Humanities Research Institute, on the theme of underground. And it seems particularly apposite to open such a festival on the 15th of October. For it was on this day in 1783 that Étienne Montgolfier became the first human being to lift off the earth, some 80 feet off the ground to be precise, in his and his brother's tethered hot air balloon in Paris. And it was on this day in 1910 that the airship America was launched from New Jersey in the first attempt made by a powered aircraft to cross the Atlantic. 3 days later, the crew ditched and the airship drifted out of sight. So 15th of October seems to be a rather good day for things going up, up and away. So it's therefore perversely apposite, it seems to me, that we should be reversing direction today and heading underground. And we're taking what seems to me to be a very creative change of direction, for what we have ahead of us over the next 10 days is a series of more than 50 events exploring the underground in all its literal and metaphorical suggestiveness. All different kinds of events, from panel discussions like this evening's to interactive theatre, from film screenings to subterranean tours, involving contributors as varied, seemingly, as novelists and musicians, historians and DJs. This is the 6th such annual event the faculty has hosted at King's, growing from the Arts and Humanities Week back in 2009 to this year's full-blown 10-day festival. The masterminds behind it are Professor Max Saunders, Director of the Arts and Humanities Research Institute, and his team, Lara Feigel, Laura Douglas, Abby Gerard, and Alexandra Crichton. I'm enormously grateful to them for all the work they've put into organising this year's festival. I'd also like to thank all of those who are contributing their expertise to the festival, not least this evening's distinguished guests. And I'd like to thank all of you for supporting what is going to be, without doubt, our best festival yet. I'd like now to hand over to Professor Max Saunders, Director of the Arts and Humanities Research Institute, who will say a little bit more about the festival and introduce this evening's panel. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Russell. And I'd like to start by particularly thanking the Faculty of Arts and Humanities for its generous support, both of the Arts and Humanities Research Institute and of the festival in particular. And I also want to acknowledge the Principals Fund for its very generous support of the festival. And I too must thank the large number of people in the college who've helped make it all possible, and particularly the brilliant team in the HRI that Russell has already mentioned, who've been incredibly tireless and creative and resilient in pulling the whole programme together over the last few months. Before we get on to our illustrious speakers tonight, I just want very quickly to mention some of the visual contributions that will be available throughout the festival. Thank you. There's the Up Folly, a sort of pop-up architectural folly in the quad between the King's Building and Somerset House, which is designed to encourage visitors to simply stop and look up, something we often forget to do in a dense and busy city like London. So please do get down among the bamboo and try looking up through it at the clouds or the stars or planes and satellites, but preferably not when it's drizzling like tonight, though even that will be an experience. So thank you to the architects involved at Mobile Studio, the fabricators, Westby and Jones, and George Heaven, the artist. I also wanted to mention two exhibitions that are going on throughout the festival, one called The Unforgettable and The Unspoken, of extraordinary photos of older gay men in Hong Kong. This is in the Anatomy Museum in this building. And also Poesis 2.0, which showcases a selection of artwork received from members of the public who are either living in or transiting through the United Arab Emirates. Again, a very special exhibition. And finally, we have an interactive work created by Richard de Domenici, which is a self-guided virtual tour called Under Your Feet, a virtual tour where you can view on your phones or tablets what's underneath you as you walk through certain areas of the campus. It should be an exciting opportunity for people to see some of the hidden spaces on the Strand campus. And you can download the app from the festival website, which is linked to the college front page at the moment. And so now on to the event that you've been waiting so patiently for, Sheltering in London in the Second World War. And I'm just going to introduce the chair, my colleague Lara Feigel from the Department of English, who will then introduce our other speakers. Lara's first book was Literature, Cinema and Politics, 1930 to 1945, which came out in 2010. And she went on to write the incredibly successful book, The Love Charm of Bombs, Restless Lives in the Second World War, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2013, and explores the wartime lives and writings of 5 writers, Elizabeth Bowen, Henry Green, Graham Greene, Rosa Macaulay, and Hilda Spiel. And she's also the co-editor with John Sutherland of a new edition of Stephen Spender's Journals. Her current project, which relates very much to tonight's talk, is about British and American writers and filmmakers involved in the reconstruction of Germany from 1945 to 49, which is enabled by a 5-year European Research Council grant called Beyond Enemy Lines, as well as a Philip Leverhulme Prize. And Lara is the co-director with Erica Carter of our Centre for Modern Literature and Culture. So please join me in welcoming Lara Feigel and her distinguished speakers.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Max, and welcome to the festival. So we're going to kick off the festival with a very literal interpretation of the theme underground. We're going to burrow our way down to the Second World War bomb shelters. And King's did have shelters of its own in the Second World War, and we did wonder about hosting tonight's event in the lecture theatre, now known slightly ominously to timetabling as -3B18. But thought we'd spare you the 3 flights of stairs and the authentic underground smell. So we'll just have to imagine the underground setting, as well as imagining your way into the shelters, imagining perhaps sandbags stacked against the walls, babies sleeping in sort of tatty suitcases, women knitting and playing cards, biscuits broken and passed round, all punctuated by the sometimes comforting and more often dementing sound of people snoring at different intervals, although perhaps we will have some of those tonight. And as we engage in this act of imagining, we couldn't have 2 better guides to help us on our way. Antony Beevor is one of our foremost historians today. His books include Stalingrad, Berlin, The Battle for Spain, D-Day, and the Second World War. They've appeared in 30 languages, selling over 6 million copies. And he's won several major prizes, including the Samuel Johnson Prize for Stalingrad. Andrew Graham-Dixon is one of our leading art critics and presenters. You'll all know him from his many groundbreaking series on the BBC, including A History of British Art and Renaissance, and most recently a very brilliant trilogy of programmes about British art at war on Bomberg, Sickert and Nash. He's judged the Turner Prize and the BP National Portrait Prize, and he's the author of several acclaimed books spanning, what seems like, the whole of Western art. So without further ado, let's move on to our talks. The plan is that each of our speakers will speak for 15 minutes. I will chair a discussion between them. You will ask questions, and then there's an unusually glamorous drinks reception upstairs in what sort of is usually the cafeteria, but tonight is masquerading as an exciting King's bar. So do join us for a drink afterwards, and now I'll hand over to Anthony.
Lara, thank you. Before going underground, I think I'm going to have to take you up in the air a little bit to explain the background. The Blitz and the subsequent bombing of Germany all began with a mistake. After the evacuation of the British Army from Dunkirk and the French capitulation, many people, even including King George VI, professed a relief that the French were no longer their allies. Chief Marshal Dowding, the head of Fighter Command, later claimed that on hearing of their surrender, he'd gone down on his knees and thanked God that no more fighters need to be risked across the Channel. He'd hardly enough left to defend southern England as invasion threatened. The British people were in a state of shock similar to a wounded soldier who feels no pain. They knew that the situation was desperate, if not catastrophic. They knew that and they knew that almost all the army's weapons and vehicles had been abandoned on the other side of the Channel. And yet, helped by Churchill's stirring oratory, they almost welcomed the stark clarity of their fate. During the first part of July 1940, the Luftwaffe simply concentrated on shipping in the Channel, the Thames Estuary and the North Sea. This they called the Kanalkampf. The Luftwaffe was confident that its pilots and aircraft were manifestly superior. The RAF had lost 136 pilots killed or captured in France. Flight training schools were pushing through as many replacements as they could, but freshly qualified pilots were almost the very first to be shot down. And even when reinforced by other nationalities, French, Belgian, Czech, and especially Poles, they were still short. The difference in British attitudes, manners, and food had been a shock to the Poles when they had first arrived from France. Few got over the memory of the fish paste sandwiches offered them on arrival in England, and they were made even more homesick by the horrors of British cuisine, from overcooked mutton and cabbage to the ubiquitous custard, which also, of course, appalled the Free French. But the warmth of their reception by most Britons astonished them, greeting them with cries of "Long live Poland." And Polish pilots, seen as dashing and heroic, found themselves mobbed and propositioned to an extraordinary degree by young British women achieving a degree of freedom for the first time. The language barrier proved less of a problem on the dance floor than in the air between British controllers and Polish pilots. Hitler ordered that no bombing raids were to be launched against London, because he still hoped that the British would come to their senses and agree to an armistice. Goering predicted that it would take less than a month to destroy the RAF by striking continually at their airfields. The constant attacks also killed and wounded riggers, fitters, batmen, and even the drivers and plotters of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Dowding had foreseen this battle of attrition, and the mounting damage was a major concern. An impressive increase in fighter production had removed one worry, but pilot losses remained Dowding's greatest anxiety. His men were so tired that they were falling asleep at mealtimes and even in the middle of a conversation. If the Germans continued, Fighter Command would be worn down completely within a couple of weeks. But then came the great German mistake. On the night of the 24th of August, 1940, a force of more than 100 German bombers overflew their targets in the Thames Estuary and bombed eastern and central London. This provoked Churchill into ordering a string of retaliatory bombing raids on Germany. They caused very little damage, but an infuriated Hitler lifted his ban on attacking London. And the consequences were, of course, to be very grave for Londoners, but it meant that the Luftwaffe switched targets. RAF Fighter Command was saved at the critical stage of the battle. Goering made the rash assumption that bombing London would bring Britain to its knees. German attacks intensified even more at the end of August and during the first week of September. Most of the German bomber squadrons headed for the docks in London. The smoke from the fierce fires guided the following waves to the target area. London, with already over 300 civilians dead and 1,300 injured, suffered many more heavy blows. But the Luftwaffe had failed to win the Battle of Britain, which was deemed to have ended at the end of October. The Blitz on London and other cities continued throughout the winter, but the night bombing campaign failed to break the will of the British people. Many complained of the sirens, and Churchill soon ordered that their prolonged banshee howlings, as he called them, should be reduced to give people a chance to sleep. The sirens go off approximately the same time every evening, an observer wrote, and in the poorer districts, queues of people carrying blankets, thermos flasks and babies begin to form quite early outside the air raid shelters. Boarded up shop windows, smashed by bomb blast, carried stickers announcing business as usual, and the inhabitants of houses destroyed in the East End of London placed paper Union Jacks on the piles of rubble which had been their homes. Worse than the tedium of our days, wrote Peter Cannell, working in the Ministry of Information, was the squalor of our restless nights. Very often we were required to work in shifts, so many hours in a stifling subterranean dormitory under hairy, much-used blankets, so many above ground, crouched at our usual desks, or, during a lull, sleep on the floor, ready to be woken up by an elderly office messenger who brought some hideous piece of news, say a direct hit on a crowded bomb shelter, from which we had to draw the sting. Yet it is odd how quickly a habit forms, how easily we adapt ourselves to unfamiliar ways of life, and how often supposed necessities are revealed as superfluities. Although Londoners faced up far better than expected to the hardships, displaying the spirit of the Blitz in underground stations, a fear of German paratroopers continued, especially among women outside London. Rumours of an invasion spread from week to week. Yet, on the 2nd of October, Operation Seelan, the German plan to invade Britain, was postponed indefinitely. In Berlin, the Nazi leadership was resigned to the fact that even the bombing campaign was unlikely to bring Britain to its knees. The view now prevails, wrote Ernst von Weizsäcker, the State Secretary in the German Foreign Office, in his diary on the 17th of November, that starvation caused by a blockade is the most important weapon against Britain, and not smoking the British out. The very word blockade carried an emotional note of revenge in Germany, obsessed with memories of the First World War and the Royal Navy's blockade. But this would now be turned against the British Isles by submarine warfare. In February 1942, Bomber Command received approval from the Cabinet to pursue an area target strategy. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris took command. Harris, a great bull of a man with a bristling moustache, had no doubts that the key to victory was the destruction of German cities. This, in his view, would avoid the necessity of sending forces to the continent to take on the Wehrmacht there. As a thick-skinned outsider who'd spent a tough life in Rhodesia, Harris saw little reason to compromise towards those he regarded as faint-hearted gentlemen. Ever since the nights he had spent during the Blitz on the roof of the Air Ministry, watching Luftwaffe bombs fall on London, Harris had longed to strike back, especially with loads of incendiaries to overwhelm the enemy's fire services. The Blitz on London and other cities had killed 41,000 civilians and injured 137,000 more. Harris was therefore not prepared to take any criticism or heed any calls to divert bombers from smashing German cities. As the British bombing campaign against Germany stepped up, pressure soon grew to withdraw Luftwaffe fighter formations and heavy flak batteries from the Eastern Front to defend the Reich. Yet Harris was now openly defining success by the number of urban acres his bombers had reduced to rubble. On the night of the 30th of May 1942, Harris launched his first 1,000-bomber raid against Cologne. The devastation was great, but comparatively little by later standards. Some 480 people were killed. Harris, a determined propagandist for Bomber Command, had assembled almost every bomber that could fly, even trainers, to achieve his 1,000-bomber figure. He, too, wanted to impress both the Americans and the Soviet Union. "Vengeance begins," was the headline in the Daily Express. Yet Harris knew that he had to mislead the public and even some of his superiors, especially Churchill, who had very mixed feelings, by pretending that their targets were of a military nature, such as oil depots and communication centres. The fact was that bombing, especially in bad visibility, was a very imprecise art, and only cities provided large enough targets. Main railway stations provided his justification for bombing the whole of a city centre. Harris, however, knew that the public was behind him. Only a few lone voices, such as George Bell, the Bishop of Chichester, spoke out. That August, when Churchill had flown to Moscow to explain to Stalin that an invasion of northern France was out of the question, the bombing of German cities was his strongest card. He was able to argue that the Bomber Command offensive was a form of second front. Hitler's armaments minister, Albert Speer, in fact expressed the same view. The bombing campaign was the only British action of which Stalin approved. Soviet intelligence was already passing back information from prisoner of war interrogations, which indicated that the morale of German troops on the Eastern Front was being undermined by constant concern for their families at home. Stalin never lost his taste for revenge, especially since around 500,000 Soviet citizens are estimated to have died as a result of Luftwaffe bombing. Red Army aviation had not developed a strategic arm, so he was content for the British to do the work for them. Goering, humiliated by the Luftwaffe's weakness against the Allied onslaught, withdrew more fighter groups from the Eastern Front for home defence. Although this was not one of the stated objectives of the Allies, the effect on the outcome of the war was far greater than the damage they were inflicting on Germany at the time. Not only did Red Army aviation begin to achieve air superiority, it also meant that the Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights had to be drastically reduced. And this, in turn, allowed the Red Army, especially in the following year, to achieve major surprise attacks. Harris was convinced that if he could do to the Nazi capital what his aircraft had done to Hamburg, Germany would surrender by the 1st of April 1944. Pathfinder aircraft dropped the red and green marker flares over Berlin, which the Germans nicknamed Christmas trees. Then Lancasters and Halifaxes carpet-bombed the city from end to end. On Harris's order, each Lancaster now carried 5 tons of bombs. The sky arches over Berlin with a blood-red eerie beauty. Goebbels wrote in his diary after one of the biggest raids, "I can no longer stand looking at it." Yet Goebbels was one of the very few Nazi leaders who went out to mingle and chat with the victims. Life was hard for ordinary Berliners trying to get to work on time through rubble-blocked streets with tram tracks torn up into fantastic shapes, and S-Bahn trains cancelled because of damage to lines. Civilians, pale and drawn from lack of sleep, hurried to work in offices and factories, even if they did not function. Those bombed out of their apartments either had to move in with friends or hoped to be rehoused by the authorities. At night, when the sirens wailed, the population would file into air raid shelters, cellars, or the vast caverns of the flak towers. They carried thermoses and small cardboard suitcases with sandwiches, their valuables and important documents. With wry Berliner humour, the sirens were called Mayor's Trumpet, a reference to Goering's fatuous boast at the beginning of the war that if the RAF ever bombed Berlin, his name was Mayor. The zoo flak tower in the Tiergarten could provide shelter for 18,000 people in its lower levels. The diarist Ursula von Kardorff described it as like a stage set for the prison scene in Fidelio, loving couples embraced on concrete spiral staircases as if taking part in a travesty of a fancy dress ball. In the ordinary shelters, known as Luftschutzräume, the air smelled rancid as the place became packed with underwashed bodies and the ubiquitous problem of halitosis. Most of the population suffered from bad teeth as a result of vitamin deficiency. Shelters were lit with blue lights and arrows, and lettering on the walls were painted in luminous paint in case the electricity supply failed. In the cellars under buildings where most people took shelter, families sat in rows facing each other as if in a U-Bahn carriage. As the buildings began to shake from the bombs, some practiced strange rituals for survival, such as wrapping their head in a towel and bending almost double. But as buildings above were hit or caught fire, and smoke and dust entered the cellar, hysteria could easily grip those down below. Holes had been knocked through sidewalls so that they could escape, if necessary, to the cellars of neighbouring blocks. Foreign workers, identified by a large letter painted on their backs, were forbidden to enter shelters and mix in such intimate circumstances with German women and children. As he had promised Churchill, Harris told his men that the Battle of Berlin would be the decisive battle of the war. But his campaign of attrition night after night wrecked the nerves of many of his own men, as well as those of Berliners. Right. His air crews went back time and time again, grasping at Harris's mantra that it would shorten the war and thus save many more lives in the end. The battle went on from August 1943 until March 1944, yet 17,000 tons of high-explosive bombs and 16,000 tons of incendiaries failed to destroy the German capital. The city was far too spread out to be vulnerable to a firestorm, and its wide open spaces, rather like London with its parks, absorbed the bulk of the bombs. Harris had badly miscalculated, and all his assurances to Churchill proved empty. Whether or not Harris suffered from a Jupiter complex, flinging down thunderbolts from heaven in retribution, an idea which the British public generally supported, his was a form of that total war which Goebbels had called for in his frenzied demand from the podium of the Sportspalast in February 1943 after Stalingrad. Harris's belief that his strategy was shortening the war to save lives was strikingly similar to the huge slogan behind Goebbels during the speech, which proclaimed total war, short war. The inevitable question of whether waging total war from the air on German civilians was the moral equivalent of the Luftwaffe's own version is too complicated to answer satisfactorily. In statistical terms, however, the combined bomber offensive against Germany turned out to be slightly less murderous in the end than the Luftwaffe's, if you include all the Western European, Central European, Balkan and Soviet citizens killed by the German Air Force. The terrible truth was that the British, having invested so much in lives, treasure and resources to create this monstrous weapon of bomber command, could not stop using it in the vain hope that it would reduce their own casualties on the ground. Thank you very much.
Some questions? Oh, sure.
Thank you very much, Antony. This is a German shelter, just to give you a few more shelters in the lead up to Andrew. Here we have a London basement shelter. At the beginning of the war, people were encouraged to dig trench shelters, which weren't especially effective. So there we have a very wet trench shelter with boards covering the flooding. Yeah, could we have the lights down slightly?
Very slightly.
Is Abby here?
Can we recreate the atmosphere of a bomb shelter?
Can anyone
We
hear
have blue
that?
lights.
Gabriel, do you put the lights down a bit? Someone is doing it. Brilliant. There we have an Anderson shelter with a man standing proudly because it stood up against the blast, although they weren't always known to do that. But I think if you put enough on top of them, they were effective. Fairly.
Certainly not to any form of direct hit.
There we have a nurse teaching some young mothers to knit in a shelter with the newborn babies sleeping above them.
Real battery of...
That's a Bill Brandt picture of a rather squashed shelter in a warehouse. And then we have tube stations. So, as lots of you will know, do you want to just... so tube stations were initially, Churchill didn't want people to shelter in tube stations, and so it was forbidden. But, of course, there was nothing to stop people just buying a ticket. And so, as it became clear that this is what was going to happen, it was sort of grudgingly allowed and then more officially allowed, and they started building bunks. So this is at the beginning before it was official, and it sort of looks more like the end of a night.
A night on the town.
A night on the town, with the trains sort of really, the trains continued to run all through the war, so you've got trains next to people sheltering on the platform. That is Elephant and Castle. lots of bits of unused tunnel, including just here, the Aldwych station, which you can now go and visit, were used as shelters. Again, looking sort of like not much sleeping is going on. More Elephant and Castle, sort of later in the evening, people sleeping.
Something for us. I think the images of very highly populated Dublin were public conveniences.
Well, this is one of the great things that people complained about. It was, at this stage, it was buckets. They had sort of 3 or 4 buckets. So it was pretty awful. So that's why then Churchill's wife starts visiting them and getting very outraged, and they start trying to, but it never quite happens. But some of them do have, by the 1941. Piccadilly Circus, Holborn, the Aldwych, where they gave over the whole station to sheltering and had 2,000 books, a library, and Shakespeare plays being performed. And then some bunks fitted. So there are some shelters, and now Andrew is going to take us through one particular experience of them. Should I give you that?
Yeah, the clicker. I'm limping because I've done my leg in. Yes, so start. Does that button go forward?
Yeah. Can we keep the lights down?
Yeah, keep the lights down as low as possible. I can't concentrate.
Well, I think the audience needs to be able to see the pictures.
Now this is exactly what's wrong with modern experience. It's denatured by the very act of recording it. It's like people in art galleries taking pictures.
Yeah, I think we need the lights down a bit because we're looking at pictures.
Yeah. So yes, I've been thinking quite a lot recently about, but when I was asked to give this talk, it sort of chimes with something else that I've been thinking about, which is to do with Gothic art and a series of programmes we've been making about the 19th century. And it's just occurred to me the extent to which one can quite easily forget just how traumatic the impact of technology has been on human existence since about 1780. It's been immensely traumatic. We've had so many new technologies, one after another. And in a sense, I think one could write the history of art or the history of literature as a succession of responses to the trauma of these new technologies. So Impressionism comes out of an experience of the city that was just completely new. 3 million people in one place. How on earth do you make sense of that? Pre-Raphaelitism, an attempt to recover nature in the face of this great storm cloud that Ruskin described gathering over England. And I think war is the biggest technological shock of all, because it's when you go to war with the new technology that you've developed that you really realise what the bloody hell this technology can do to you. And I think that was partly the subject of the series that I recently made for BBC4 about British artists at war in World War I, where, to a degree, you've got this horrible collision of the codes of chivalry inherited from the 19th century and the past being applied to modern combat. So just keep walking in that direction because it's cowardly to do anything else, while the machine guns mow you down. And war is what makes us deeply aware, and artists, when they respond to war, make us deeply, deeply aware of the strangeness of it. They throw us back into the strangeness of what it must have been like to live it in a way that I think raw history, no matter how well written, no matter how well composed, never quite manages, because it doesn't give you that visceral shock of it. I've begun with Picasso because I think Guernica is seen by many people as the quintessential war painting of the 20th century. But it's not the only war painting, and Picasso's way of looking at war wasn't the only way. I think war has had a profound effect on the development of artistic styles in a way that perhaps still isn't sufficiently acknowledged. Why is surrealism, as it were, the default language of modern artists after World War I? Because the world makes no sense. So surrealism is the only style that Paul Nash, for example, in his shell-shocked state, he thinks, yes, an art that is inherently, innately illogical, that matches my experience of reality. So forget all of the teachings of Henry Tonks and getting a tree in line with a hill. No. This is much better, a dreamscape that captures my sense of nightmare. So that's post-war trauma. why is Cubism suddenly abandoned by so many avant-garde artists after 1918? Because people on the streets of London and Paris are Cubist. Their faces are where their noses should be. It is a time, I mean, my mother, who grew up in the 30s, said you can't imagine growing up in the 70s what it was like. Everywhere, people with one arm, one leg. People had been decomposed, and I think we can quite easily forget the effect that war has had on the artistic imagination, really direct effects. The technology, yes, and war really brings that technology home. And I think, I've got a couple of examples. Oh, that's not very good, is it, using the mouse? This is David Bomberg, possibly the wrong way round, surveying St Paul's and giving us, I think, well, as Antony said, we're starting above ground. This is Bomberg surveying the miracle of the survival of St Paul's and doing the image in charcoal, burnt wood, which is what London must have smelt of. And I love this picture because, I mean, maybe it's my fantasy, but I think when I look at it and I see it and I have it in front of me, I think, gosh, I really am almost there. You know, I can smell the charred wood and I can feel the vapour rising through this suddenly destroyed city. The surrealism as well, a lot of historical accounts, you read people saying, how strange it is, Henry Moore said this himself, how strange it is that people go shopping the next day. And they still go shopping and the shops still have business as usual, pasted on the boarded up front. So I think this is a wonderful image, but he's of course above ground. This is, I suppose, my favourite British image of the havoc that's been wrought in the skies, this desperate attempt to hold back what's coming, which of course doesn't entirely work. And this is Nash towards the end of his life, thinking about the Second World War, and I think he always tends to see war as a kind of distortion of the natural order of things. So in his First World War images, they're very much like landscape paintings, and the landscape has become this seething pit full of cadavers that have been buried by the mud of trench warfare. And this is much more battle in the sky, except it's clouds that aren't where clouds should be, and clouds behaving in ways that clouds shouldn't behave, and that cloud in particular, which is the death cloud of a German Icarus falling into the water to die. There's a wonderful book about Henry Moore's shelter drawings, which I've shamelessly used in preparing what I have to say about, by Julian Andrews, the British Council. It's very good. It's got a wonderful... He makes the point that one of the reasons why shelters became very important early on, Antony will correct me if this is historically wrong, but it has the ring of truth, is that the anti-aircraft, the people in charge of the anti-aircraft defences, they weren't regarded very highly. It was sort of the last resort. You know, like they got the worst soldiers or they got the worst recruits. And there's a great description by the Commander-in-Chief of AA Command, General Frederick Pyle, writing about the difficulties caused by the fact that his units were being given the leavings after the other services had had their pick. My men had passed through recruiting centres where they had had extensive medical examinations, but many of them were quite unsuited to any military duty, let alone the highly technical duties of anti-aircraft. Out of 25 who arrived at a fairly representative battery, one had a withered arm, one was mentally deficient, one had no thumbs, one had a glass eye which fell out whenever he doubled to get to the guns, and two were in the advanced and most obvious stages of venereal disease. This percentage was fairly common. So there wasn't a huge amount of confidence in that first line of defence, well, second line, because there were the radar towers. So the shelters quickly became a hugely sort of, you know, the mass option. And Henry Moore, a lot of people think that these pictures, this is one of his shelter drawings, one of the more abstract ones, where the figures almost have a vermicular quality, like human beings who've been turned into worms, wriggling in the ground. They're full of sort of metaphorical suggestion, his images. Sometimes I think he sees this sheltering as I mean, for me, Henry Moore is one of the more positive artists of the 20th century. Is that he's constantly trying to turn the modern language of anxiety and doubt, so brilliantly twisted towards Gothic extreme craziness by Bacon. Moore is always trying to make things better. He's always trying to find the, oh yes, well that's a mother and child. It's about nurture. He's unusual among modern artists in that he's trying to bring a smile to your face, or at least trying to make you have some sense of spiritual comfort or nourishment. I think he's very strongly influenced by the medieval religious sculptors of the past. But that's his basic approach. But confronted by war, I think even he, is quite ambivalent. So sometimes the figures seem to be comfort each other. Sometimes they seem to be wriggling in the dark, as I say, like worms. So he sees the sinister aspect of it, but he also sees the nurturing aspect of it, because that is his way. As in here, again, I think it's very ambiguous. Are these figures down in the tunnel comforting each other, or are they in a grave of their own making, wrapped in their swaddling clothes? He was very reticent about what these images meant. He didn't begin the series as a commissioned cycle of drawings. He'd begun them because he was going from Hampstead, where he had his studio with his wife, to have dinner with some friends, but his car broke down, so they took the tube. And he just happened to go into the tube on one of these nights, and the train was stopped at Belsize Park, and he was told to get out of the station, and they all just had to wait there for an hour. So he experienced this strange world, very different from the above-ground shelters, or the Anderson-type shelters that you could build in your own garden, where if you got a direct hit, you could hear everything going on in those shelters. You could hear it, if you hoped not to get a direct hit. If you didn't get a direct hit, you'd probably be okay. But massive chaos and anarchy. But down in the tube, you barely heard a thing. He said it was like this strange life in an aquarium. It was subterranean. We felt almost like we were all fish, sleeping at the bottom of the pond while things happened above, and you could just hear the faint tremor of explosions. So it's quieter than I'd imagined until reading some of the documents published in this book. And so he describes it. We stayed there for an hour. This is on the 11th of September 1940, just at the beginning of this. This was the experience that really started his engagement with the subject. We stayed there for an hour, and I was fascinated by the sight of people camping out deep under the ground. I had never seen so many reclining figures, and even the holes out of which the trains were coming seemed to me like the holes in my sculpture. And there were intimate little touches. Children fast asleep, with trains still roaring past only a couple of yards away. People who were obviously strangers to one another, forming tight little intimate groups. They were cut off from what was happening up above, but they were aware of it. There was tension in the air. That's just about the most revealing thing he ever said, because he was actually very reticent about the images. Some of them, some are much better than others, because he was encouraged. Kenneth Clark saw them and was excited about them, because he saw in them the possibility for, I think, an artist to make work that he was genuinely into making, but which also very much expressed, and it was hard to get that marriage. You get a contemporary artist really to make the work he's into making, it might be very, very opposed to war, and it often was. So to get this was a kind of art made by a modern artist that does seem to express national solidarity, positive feelings, without being overt propaganda. So Clark was very excited by it and encouraged Moore to do it, and said, well, even though you're not an official war artist, what we'll do is that the official, I can't remember the name of the body, but the official War Artists Commission or agency will buy the work from you. And they bought, I think, I can't remember how many pieces it was, like 32 drawings for 38 guineas or something like that, which was great for Moore because he was absolutely strapped for cash at the time because he couldn't sell any sculptures. And his work at Chelsea School of Art was at an end because half the college had been bombed and his studio had been firebombed. So, just keep going through the images. And he depicts, yes, he's very interested in, Henry Moore's very interested in this, he's very interested in shapes that suggest nurture. He loves shapes that are simultaneously monumental and intimate. So a tube tunnel is right up his alley, if that isn't a terrible mixture of messages, because it simultaneously suggests the holes or declivities in one of his sculptures, but it also suggests arteries, blood, the birth canal. It's full of metaphors, and you can't ever quite pin one down. Are these people being reborn? Are they being preserved? Has the tube shelter become a kind of womb where you can retreat or go back to from the violence of what's going outside? But I think those suggestions or hints just come naturally out of the subject and Moore's interaction with them. I don't think he's forcing it. I mean, he talks about, in some of his notes, his scrawls notes, and he mentions things like Etruscan figures. He was also reminded by, if I go back quickly, he was also reminded by images like that of the plaster casts that had been created by the archaeologists who excavated Pompeii. I don't know if you know about that, but when they discovered Pompeii, what they found was that if they injected plaster into the holes, and it's very grisly, into the holes inside the ash, the holes were the shape of the people, the dogs or creatures that had been killed in that moment of death. And you'd actually find, people going like that. And these plaster casts that were made at that time still exist. And Moore was fascinated by them because they're sort of sculptures made by the force of nature. And I think there's an element of that he feels almost like he's an archaeologist digging out something that's actually a moment of modern experience. And these are almost figures in that Pompeii moment of being on the edge perhaps of death, but they're surviving. That's an image of the actual experience of the shelter, which, I mean, again, I think it's great that we've got these images, and because you can see so clearly, if you move from something like that to something like that, you can see what how much Henry Moore makes of it, what he does with it, the extent to which he abstractifies what in a sense is almost, when you look at a picture, it almost looks like, what it used to look like under Waterloo Bridge about 20 years ago, people living in boxes. It looks like hundreds of those all put in one place. He mentions something about the sanitary conditions in one of his letters, actually. I can't remember what he says. He says that all the people at the different tube stations compete with one another, the actual staff. Because they're going, one of the heroes of the time is that the staff of, Camden Town Tube, we've got the best, we've got the best latrines going. We really, doesn't stink of piss down in our tunnel. There was a kind of, there was competition, campanilismo, the Italians would call it, between one tube station and another. He focuses on these sort of figures again, very much, between life and death. It's art, because of course when he's doing these pictures, he doesn't know who's going to win the war, he doesn't know what's going to happen. These people are between life and death. It's only with the benefit of hindsight that we know most of those people probably survived. Some people think that, because after the war, Moore increasingly became involved in draped figures. Previously his figures had been more bony and angular, and there's no hint of drapery. Drapery hadn't been something that he was involved with, although he looked at artists like the Pisano brothers and was interested in drapery as an expression of sculptural genius and so on. But it's only actually after these images that he seems to have very much become involved with draping his own figures. So the experience of the tube and making the drawings had an impact on his sculpture as well. Those are those figures from, that's what they actually look like, the cast from Pompeii. So you can see how Moore might have felt that. It's almost as if his figures drawing are those figures, because they were taking shelter. That's what they were doing. They were all found in the basements of their houses in Pompeii, covered in hot ash. What they weren't found, the space left by their body was found. And you only get it when you inject plaster into the cavity in the ash. And you realise, oh gosh, that's where a dog died. Or that's where a person died, that's a baby. It's very grisly. But it's, in his images, it's almost as if those figures have been taken to London and they come back to life. And they're sheltering when it's like they're going to stretch out again. And I find that sort of quite touching. There is something very touching. Just Moore's sense that it's in the nature of human life to undergo these terrible trials. And they did it, and none of them lived. Maybe we will. So that's almost perhaps he's trying to get a sense of perspective and think, well, everything's terrible. Things have often been terrible, and people have gone through sometimes, and sometimes they haven't. These are perhaps some of the thoughts that are expressed by the drawings. I like that. Again, I think that is, and I think it's almost as well, because there's a very strong interest, as I'm sure you all know, in the 30s, in quotes, primitive cultures. Picasso, well, going back to the start of the 20th century, Picasso nipping off to the local African section of the Louvre just around the corner and saying, does anybody want anything? Picking up, like, just basically stealing African figurines from the museums, probably London. So there's this sort of fascination with, in quotes, primitive art. And I think that Moore, I think he's perhaps suggesting that for all our technology, and you have to remember that the tube, in its own time, was a technological marvel. The tube was the sort of apogee of the Industrial Revolution, written as the absolute cutting edge of what a technological country is. And we've built the tube. It's the very first railway that goes under the ground. So the tube is this, was in its time, this massive new thing. Steel network connecting a city underground. What a miracle. And yet, for all our technology, for all our steam technology, which becomes the technology of war that is creating the bombs that are raining down, our technology is actually turning us back into cavemen. And our tube tunnel, which was once our symbol of our modernity, is now taken us back. We've gone, it's like when you go, if you play a pinball machine long enough and you get up to 1 million, it goes back to zero. That's where we've gone back to zero. We've gone back to the cave. It's what Conrad writes about in Heart of Darkness. And that's what Heart of Darkness is about, really. I mean, who's the caveman in that? Smearing blood. It's about, you get to a certain point of civilization and you actually go back to zero. And I think Moore's perhaps saying that in these images as well. I also think that they're very, these are the sort of sleeping figures, which perhaps are the slightly more human aspects of them. I also think that it's interesting that the British, in a sense, I've been also making a TV series about the Gothic, by which I include just Dracula, but I include Dickens and the idea of the city as a Gothic labyrinth, and where is horror to be found, and how do we imagine what is horrific, and tunnels and passages and secret dark places. And of course, what could be more Gothic than these images? Because that's a sort of somnambulist's underground castle that has been made by war. So it's a piece of Gothic surrealism that's been brought into existence by the atrocity of war. And in my sort of garbled mixing of metaphors and throwing of references, I think what I'm trying to express is the richness that Moore, I think, found in this subject, and the way in which he tapped into so many different aspects of not only wartime experience, the human experience of being at war, but also that he drew on cultural memories in a very interesting way, and drew together different strands, and I think he was thinking about a lot of different things, and in this sort of collision of a subject that seems to combine what is most modern of all, the horror of war, which is with what is most ancient of all, the human need for shelter, which goes back to Lascaux, the caveman, which is where human art begins. I think that wonderful and still perhaps, underappreciated works of art, which I hope I've made you find more interesting than you might have if I hadn't been yabbering on. Yes! Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So I wonder if we could start by thinking, looking at these more drawings and reading his statements about the shelters makes me think of Graham Greene, who had quite a different approach to sheltering, and that it was something he particularly enjoyed. And unlike Moore, who's very much looking from outside, Greene he joined a particular shelter community. He was an ARP warden with Dorothy Glover, his lover at the time, who was the shelter warden, and sort of loved getting to know the prostitutes and slept there sort of regularly. And it struck me, in terms of this sort of notion of the People's War, which sort of gets brought out and discredited in equal measure, that Greene was having a sort of cross-class experience in that shelter, where it seems to me that Moore is very much going in from the outside.
Well, Moore does. There's a good quote in here, actually. I think if I find it, where he writes about just that class sort of breadth, and there's some quite interesting stuff that's also quoted in this book about the extent to which the Communist Party at the time was very much, the shelters, they're yours. 40 million pounds of your taxes have built that tube, and you use it. The people's power, and Moore is very aware of the fact of who's there.
Do you think
the people there are not necessarily the people that he went to have dinner with in his car?
And do you think that
Kenneth Clark isn't in there?
No. Do you think there's an outsider perspective in the pictures?
Well, I think he's so fascinated. This is the quote is striking because it's so much at odds with the pictures. This is just a note scribbled on one of the drawings. Sick woman in bath chair, women and children with bundles, bearded Jews blanketed sleeping in deck chairs, all kinds and colours of blankets, sheets and old coats, men with shawls to keep off drafts, women wearing handkerchiefs on heads, woman and girl eating in a shelter, short-sighted man reading in underground, etc., etc., etc. But that kind of specificity is very missing from the drawings, because I think what he's interested in is, he's got a naturally mythic imagination, Henry Moore, and I think that's why one of the reasons Kenneth Clark's... Can your eyes prick up? No. Kenneth Clark's eyes were drawn, because he's making a myth out of the war, almost without... That's what he does with subject matter. So he was never going to really catch that thing that you're talking about, that Greene catches. That's more of in a way, I think it's maybe more of a thing for a writer to catch. Edward Ardisoni does some good drawings of people waiting outside or being inside shelters, which are much more socially specific, as you'd expect.
And what's your sense of whether sort of the shelters did enable some kind of coming together across the classes, or do you feel they were class specific?
No, I think they were pretty class-specific because basically, the rich tended to be in the shelters of the Dorchester Hotel or the Savoy or whatever, who had very, very solid structures which would have sustained even a direct hit. On the whole, of course, the reason why many of the poor were the ones who suffered the most was because on the whole, the bombers followed the line of the river and they were going for the East End and the docks, which was their idea. And that's why the Queen Mother came out with her famous remark about, at last I can face the East End, or I can look them in the face, rather, was her thing. At last I can look the East End in the face, when Buckingham Palace finally just had a bomb, on one edge and in the garden. So, no, I think there was a very much of a class divide.
In one of the documents I read, it suggested that the one kind of house that isn't appropriate to build, I can't remember the name of the temporary shelters. But you can't,
shelters, yes.
Yeah, you can't build them, and terraced housing is really impossible for them. You can only build those brick ones that go in the street, which of course stop people going down the street.
Yeah.
But so that all the East Enders were much more likely to have to just go to seek shelter in the Tube or in some of these bigger shelters elsewhere.
But there was one night when some communist EastEnders went to occupy the Savoy.
Yes. Well, no, I mean, I don't know many of the details. But on the whole, I mean, the communists tended to be very much more activist and militant, really, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, because up till then they were still in an embarrassing position of actually the party technically being allies of Nazi Germany. So they had to be, they were fairly restrained until that particular point.
So they went to occupy the shelter in the Savoy, feeling like there wasn't quite enough provision, and found there that the shelter was segregated between blue, green and pink areas, where people were sort of served food on trays. And luckily the staff were sort of friendly enough that they gave them tea and toast and kept them until morning. But unfortunately, it was just a one night of the Blitz experience. I wonder if we could talk a bit about public art, because it feels like when Kenneth Clark takes on these pictures, he turns them into something else, that initially they're sort of Moore's private imagination, sort of given free rein, and then they become a symbol of something. Does that change what the pictures are, and how is art changing at this moment by being co-opted into it?
I think they change to a degree. I think it's one of the problems that happens when anybody gets hold of an artist who isn't the artist. You see it, I mean, nowadays it's dealers. You know, can I have 48 of those, please, Anselm Kiefer? Yeah, go on. So he makes 48, and therefore they're not very good anymore, and that's why the show at the Royal Academy isn't very good. Because he's just making far too much stuff for money. And Henry Moore was making too many of those drawings because Kenneth Clark wanted them. And Henry Moore's assistant, Bernard Meadows, actually said in his autobiography, you know, that it wasn't good for Moore that Kenneth Clark wanted so many of them, because it made them, you know, they got worse, he got stale.
Mm.
I wish there was someone to say that to people now. You know.
Yes.
Do you think it changes? There's a good quote from Moore at the beginning where he says, hundreds and hundreds of people who are having things done to them, they were quite powerless to resist, which sort of makes these pictures, when he was first doing them, into a kind of form of protest, but yet they then get co-opted into being a sort of symbol of what of the way that we're sort of...
Yeah, I think that, I'm not sure, you know, I think the thing about propaganda is that it always wants things to mean just one thing. So what would they be? They'd be an image of Britain's great solidarity in the face of the evil onslaught of an evil empire, but they're not that.
No.
I mean, and you can try to make them into that, but they won't do it. They won't rally like a, you know, picture painted by one of Stalin's puppy dogs.
And do you want to talk a bit about the role of art in the war generally? Suddenly artists are being used as part of the war effort.
Well, it varied obviously from country to country. I mean, what was striking was the way that artists were used, say, during the Spanish Civil War, particularly in the design of posters and in that way. And it happened to a certain degree here, but there was never the sort of the propaganda use of art, which you had seen obviously in Nazi Germany, and which continued, whether it was the ghastly caricatures, say, of Jews in posters, or the idealistic portrayal of Aryan youth facing up against the Bolshevik menace. But certainly one saw this sort of hybrid mix, really, of sort of art and caricature in Germany, which you didn't see in other countries. America went very much more towards the degree of, if you like, the movie poster. I mean, it's very striking to see the American propaganda posters, whether it's sort of Rosie the Riveter or some of those ones where you see the sort of naval guns sticking out of the thing. I mean, they could have been advertising a movie, you know, the Second World War, the movie, rather than just being sort of straightforward posters in their way.
I think it was P.J., I don't know how to pronounce his name, Conody, who was associated with the War Artists Commission. He wrote about Nash's painting Dead Sea. He made the point, I think, at a speech at some embassy where it was shown, I think just after the war, but he made the point that, yes, it's very ambiguous, and in some senses it's rather unsatisfactory as propaganda, but that's the whole point. That's what we're like in Britain. We're free. And it's an official painting, but we've allowed the artist to say, so it's quite a cunning argument. And I think that gets taken up later by, is it the CIA or the FBI, who decide to, no, it's CIA, isn't it, who decide that they think that abstract expressionism is fantastic, because really what Jackson Pollock was really expressing is free market economics. What he's really expressing is freedom of individual expression, which is American, and it's not being told. So this is actually great propaganda for the American way of life, because you can just do what you like.
Yeah, but surely that was also slightly the Congress of Cultural Freedom, as the CIA front called it, which was basically encouraging anything which was more or less the opposite of Soviet realism. I mean, of socialist realism.
Yeah. It was. How far removed can you get? But it's strange to imagine a world where that can be seen as almost as propaganda. You can't imagine that now.
And I think you're right that begins in the Second World War, with the sense that the Nazis are sort of regimented and clear in their messages, and therefore anything that is sort of small and ordinary is somehow English. And so you get Humphrey Jennings' war films sort of celebrating blades of grass and sort of community singing.
Well, it's interesting to see quite how similar a lot of Nazi and Soviet art was in that particular way. I've always been struck by the way that both Hitler and Stalin were obsessed with the cinema. And you're tempted to think that in fact they, in a curious way, saw themselves as sort of great film directors, almost controlling not just an epic movie, but I mean the whole world almost under their direction.
I think we'll open up to audience questions, but just before we do so, I just wanted to sort of say something about the fact that we'd made it seem as though everyone was sheltering, but in fact only 177,000 Londoners went into the tube stations at the height of the Blitz. There were only about 4% of Londoners in tube stations and only about 9% in public shelters. One novelist at the time said it was because the English, above all, feared boredom. Do you think this is true, and did more Germans shelter than British?
No, I think the British feared intimacy, particularly intimacy with strangers. I think. I don't know how much sort of apologies there were about stepping on somebody as you were trying to get down get along the platform or whatever to your spot. But what I'm intrigued to know is, I mean, was there any case of rather like sort of the Germans getting their towels on the beach first? I mean, down in the shelters where people sort of trying to bag their spot early on.
Well, my sense of this right is that it was much more regimented in Germany, and that it was run by the military.
So. Oh, they had everything in their shelters. They had even special rooms made in vast concrete. I mean, the concrete structures, which you can still see in some cases, the Gesundbrunner metro station, underground station, U-Bahn station, which is still got. You can see all the signs and everything like that. I filmed that. But what was interesting was that you had these sort of organised things, and actually you did have many more lavatories, but they soon found that actually they had to take the doors off the lavatories because people were locking themselves in and committing suicide. And so then they just had to replace them with curtains.
Gosh. Why go there to commit suicide?
In a way, I think because it was sort of more anonymous than because if you committed suicide at home, someday, or maybe a member of your family would have to deal with it, but it would be the impersonal authority, it would be the authorities, basically.
Yeah, you think with carpet bombing there was sort of ample...
Well, I think that, I don't know whether I can't say whether it was sort of a spur of the moment decision or whether people had sort of planned it in advance, but that was definitely one of the reasons why they had to start taking the doors off.
Well, that at least wasn't a possibility in the British shelters where there were no doors. That was one of the many complaints. Thank you very much. Let's open up to some questions. Do we have a roving microphone? Yes, brilliant. One at the back.
And one at the front.
And one at the front.
Two quite different questions. First, is it known what produced that navigational error on 24th of August, the overshoot of the docks and bombing of London? Because it's often been pointed out that the navigation to the docks was fairly easy. The Germans just flew up the Thames. And secondly,
Chislehurst Caves.
Chislehurst Caves, which were extensively used by EastEnders who came down by train and slept in really quite organised conditions, bunks erected, which can still be seen because the caves were open as a museum.
I can only really talk on the, and even then not very satisfactory, I'm afraid. I don't think anybody really knows the full reason for it. It was a very early stage for the Germans to actually be using bombers at night. And I think they just sort of carried on down the Thames estuary, and probably by that stage they'd just simply gone too far, and rather than turn around and find their target, it just seemed to be easier to the squadrons or the Geschwader, whatever they were involved, simply just to let their bombs go where they were. And Goering, having been bawled out by Hitler, of course, was furious, but that was, in a way, what triggered it off. But it was going to happen at some stage, almost in any case, I think.
Chislehurst Caves,
I didn't mention them because Henry Moore didn't paint them.
Lots of networks, there were sort of various networks of caves in Britain used by shelterers. They even evacuated a whole children's ward from the hospital because they were seen as so safe. Do you want to talk about the art being stored in caves?
They stored art in caves.
They stored art in caves. They also stored art in a tube station.
There was a huge, the art was sheltered in even more secure places. Was it a salt mine? Somewhere in Scotland. I've forgotten the details.
Wales as well.
Wales, that's it, it was Wales. It's a huge slate mine, that's it. And there are amazing photographs of it, of the sort of, paintings by Titian being hauled down into the caves. And I think the Germans did the same.
Oh, absolutely. Didn't they just have sort of one painting of the week hanging in the National Gallery?
That's right.
But also the war artist pictures. Some of the more ones were hanging in there.
But it was hugely popular. That was a Kenneth Clark initiative. So we're not going to close the National Gallery, but we're only going to have one painting at a time, and we're not going to tell you where the others are.
And in fact, some were just by here. Some were in the tunnel by the Aldwych. So we can go there and imagine it.
Yeah.
Question in the front.
Yeah, I'm Stephen Duncan. I'm a sculptor, and I did an installation of my work in the underground about a decade ago at Gloucester Road Tube Station, and we had to install the work at night between 1 and 5 o'clock in the morning when the power was off. So that, in a sense, was quite an exciting and transgressive experience. And I was looking at the slide that you had of people sleeping between the rails, presumably, that particular time when they cut the power off, obviously. Is this a very transgressive time for people in London during the war? What else was going on in the underground besides sleeping?
Well, dancing isn't allowed. No, sex isn't allowed because it might lead to dancing.
There was certainly sex in the dark corners of the underground, and Churchill's wife was rather shocked when she first came across it. Graham Greene was one of the...
How did Churchill's wife come across it? Oh, someone having sex.
I think exactly that.
Fantastic.
Graham Greene was one of the culprits. He was one of many men in London who had taken the opportunity of the Blitz to evacuate his wife and children, and was he was sharing his shelter experiences with Dorothy Glover, his mistress. And at one point, a government official decided to inspect the shelters because they'd heard about that there was too much iniquity, and came down to this particular shelter and was being shown around by the ARP warden, and sort of came across Greene and Dorothy and said, "What's going on there?" And the warden said, "Well, that's one of our best ARP wardens, in fact, and his lovely wife." So he was left to it. So absolutely, the war was a time of intense emotions and
evacuations.
Yes. Any more questions? Yes. Do we have...
There's one.
Lots of crime.
And one in the front.
And one here.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was surprised when you said that the bomber command had not been as successful as the Luftwaffe. And I'd read Siebold.
Sorry, could you keep it?
The bombing command not as successful as the Luftwaffe.
Siebold's book, is it On the Nature of Destruction?
Yes.
He described something I had no idea of, a really systematic plan to destroy completely all German cities and towns.
This is absolutely true. Sebalt's book on the natural history of destruction is a superb book and a very important one, because he was actually the first one to develop what I mentioned at the end, which was this, having created this monster, that it was almost unthinkable to stop using it, even at that stage when most cities had already been destroyed. What was appalling was the way that Harris had these special albums bound in Air Force blue leather, which he proudly showed to people with sort of overlays and all the rest of it, on how much they destroyed of this city or that city. And he was hoping to have destroyed sort of, the top 60 largest cities in Germany, before the war ended. In his case, I'm afraid it had become a complete obsession, and I think it's one of Churchill's grave faults that he didn't stop and prevent it. Because obviously you can, as I was trying to say, you can make a military justification, not of course a moral justification for the bombing campaign simply because of the effect it had on the Eastern Front. But by the time it came to, say, the late autumn of 1944, and particularly in 1945, there was no justification to go on smashing these cities, but it was partly blood guilt towards Stalin and requests from the Red Army to bomb the cities of communication centres behind the Eastern Front, and that meant Dresden. We don't hear about the other cities which were destroyed like Dresden at that particular period in February 45, but there were several others which were destroyed in more or less the same way. But the trouble was, of course, Dresden was famous as sort of, the Saxon, the jewel and all the rest of it. And of course, the number of people who were caught up in the firestorm. But that was, it was something which was, I'm afraid, totally wrong. You can't blame the bomber command crews, but I'm afraid to say Harris, having got this idea into his head, just simply would not stop. And he'd been turned into a hero by the press because it was the only way of fighting back in 1941 and 1942. But as Sebald rightly describes, when British officers actually reached Germany in 1945, they were simply appalled by what had been inflicted.
There's a long British tradition of really being very, very, very efficient at destroying things when we set our mind to it. It reminds me a little bit of, although he's not killing people, but to a degree they did, but when you think of people like Dowsing in the 17th century, or the lieutenants of the Church of England who basically destroyed everything, completely destroyed everything in every English church. Amazing achievement, really difficult to do. It didn't happen anywhere else. So there's some kind of British destroy things gene.
Oh, well, come on, 30 years war. 30 years war, I think it was...
but not quite so systematically complete. We will remove... If you read Dowsing's diary, it's like, I will go to that village and I will destroy everything in that church, and then I'll go to the next and I'll destroy everything in that church. And I will not stop until I've destroyed everything. It's a little bit like those books that you describe are so ghoulish, because they give you the whole city, don't they? And then you peel back the layers to the rubble. And it's like, that's what I've done.
Question here.
Hello. Were a lot of people employed as artists, and did they not have to be soldiers? With it, how many?
Not very many.
Do you know how many?
41. No, I don't.
I think that's quite a good estimate. I think
yes,
probably...
fairly good guess.
And it was a way to avoid fighting. And interestingly, writers were campaigning to have an equivalent scheme for writers. Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh were trying to get one off the ground and didn't manage because it was somehow seen as less useful than drawing. And the war artists were drawing everything. They were in factories and at the front.
Stanley Spencer was one of them. But sort of the munitions effort was more his subject. It was painting the docks and the shipbuilders.
And even then, after the war, went into Germany to sort of draw what we'd achieved there. Yeah, one in the middle and another one at the front. Do you want to, if you go next and if we get the microphone going that way? Yeah.
Could you tell me something about the process of Moore's drawings? Was he working from memory? Was he working from transcriptions? Or
he was filmed famously for a film called Out of Chaos, which was a sort of documentary film about the war artists. Paul Nash is included as well. And there's film footage of him. You know, it's very Henry Moore drawing passengers on the tube and sleeping as bombs fall all around London. Moore has been working. But Moore felt that it gave a very wrong impression of his working practice and that he'd sort of been talked into making it look as if that's how he worked. So he seems to have made sketches that are sort of aide-memoire, but most of it is done from memory in another place, back at home, basically.
And spends quite a lot of time protesting and sort of insisting that he doesn't do it and that it's somehow inappropriate. Do you think?
Yes, he says it would. I mean, he says it would have been as tactless as drawing the inhabitants in the hold of a slave ship in the 19th century. So he sort of compares the,
which is a strange image.
I think it's the idea of the photographer going into the house of somebody who's bereaved and photographing you while you're mourning. I think it's that idea that you don't intrude on people who are in the middle of trying to survive by drawing them. It's too cold and objective a thing to seem to be doing. I think that's his thought process.
I think that's why they're so powerful, because they kind of focus in on the essential elements as opposed to having so much information around them.
Well, that is also the way his mind works.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think of another war artist, George Gross, who does just Das Krieg, the war, I mean, those things are incredible because they're so teeming with detail, like the ghouls of the guys in the gas masks. I mean, they're really viscerally detailed. So I don't think it's not necessarily more powerful because it's one or the other, but Henry Moore is powerful and he's that way, I think.
Two final questions there and there.
The word underground has two connotations, underground, and particularly for Londoners at the time, the underground.
The Londoners.
I wondered whether this bears at all on the fact that no mention has been made of the extensive bombing throughout all of the industrial cities in the early part of the war, and did a special kind of art emerge? That's one point. The second point I'd like to make is that the underground, like any other shelter, was important because you had the air raid warning, which gave, because of the speed of aircraft, enough time to get into a shelter, a home shelter or a street shelter. But the second phase of the bombing, the V1, the doodlebugs, they travelled at 500 to 600 miles an hour. You had very little warning, and there were 7 seconds between when the rocket engine cut out and the bomb arrived on your doorstep. And with regard to the second, the V2 rockets, there was no warning, just the explosion. So there is quite a contrast that can be made, or might be made, with the appropriate mind to do it, between those two phases of the war.
When we don't have more drawing, do you want to talk about, did people shelter during?
Sorry, I didn't.
It was about the difference between the Blitz and the V1s and V2s and the fact that it was almost impossible to shelter.
No, this is true, and in fact, Herbert Morrison, the Home Secretary, thought in 1944 that, that even though people had felt London could take it in 1940, they were severely worried about the state of morale in 44. because despite all of the efforts to bomb the launch sites by anti-aircraft guns were no good at all. But in fact, the very, very fast fighters like the Tempest were able to even get up alongside the V-1s and tip them over, not by just using the air pressure of their wings. But that wasn't good enough. I mean, there were too many of them coming over. But one has to remember, fortunately, most of them didn't actually reach London. The British were quite clever in the way that they managed to somehow bend the ray, not whatever it was, the electronic sort of direction finder, but also what they managed to do was to pass back information via the spies, the so-called German spies, which they had under their control, to try to tell the Germans that actually they were overshooting London, and so they started reducing the range. So in fact, if you like, people in the countryside in Sussex and Kent tended to suffer rather more than Londoners, but at least many fewer people were killed.
But in particular, Greater London, not just the counties.
No, it was, absolutely Greater London, yes, with the suburbs.
One final question. Could you pass the microphone behind you to Dennis?
You've talked about England and you've talked about Germany. As we have a great historian of the war in Russia with us, I wonder if I can ask you about the equivalents in Russia. I'm thinking of one of the most iconic images to come out of the war in Russia connected with the arts, which is Shostakovich, probably faked, fire watching on the roof, and his Leningrad Symphony, which travelled halfway around the world in score, as a great demonstration of the experience of war. I wonder, both Antony Beevor and Andrew, if you can tell us about what the reactions artistically were like in Russia at this time.
Sorry, what the
reactions were like artistically in Russia.
The equivalents, in other words, of the Moors.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, there was incredible pride in Russia and also in Leningrad. One has to remember that it was the premiere, the initial performance, did not take place in Leningrad, and this was all sort of slightly sort of hushed over later, because when they tried to do the worldwide broadcast, the implication was that it was sort of, the first performance in Leningrad, sort of coming out to the world. So of course there was a huge sort of propaganda manipulation in that particular way. But it did mean a hell of a lot. It meant a tremendous amount to the Soviet people at the time in pride. What they were perhaps less aware of was, how close Shostakovich had been to disappearing into the Gulag beforehand. But that was another question. But no, I think that sort of, pride in Russian culture was used as a major element of Soviet propaganda, purely to try to contrast themselves with what they regarded the Nazis, the Germans, as being the sort of destroyers of culture. And of course, there was a certain amount of sort of Kulturkampf even coming from the German side. So inevitably they were, totally opposed in that sense.
Some of Stalin's most rousing speeches were made in the Moscow underground.
Yes, exactly.
And if Henry Moore had drawn shelterers in Moscow, taking refuge, he would have had to draw them against the monumental figures of allegorical Soviet sculptures demonstrating the labourer achieving Stakhanovite output norms, and so on. So the tube was already in Moscow a kind of living, growing, organically developing work of art designed to carry the changing ideals of the communist revolution as it sort of morphed from one atrocity into another.
There were comparatively few Luftwaffe raids on Moscow simply because of the range of their bombers, but even so, there was a tremendous sort of culture developed there during the time when the air raid sirens went off. But Stalin was determined that the Soviet capital should be defended, and the concentration of anti-aircraft batteries around Moscow was simply staggering. But Andrew's absolutely right to point out, in fact, he made the famous October Revolution speech in 1941 with the Germans very close to approaching Moscow. From down in the, in fact, they had the whole ceremony down there, and then the following day, when there was the march past Lenin's mausoleum, the troops, copying this idea actually from the Spanish Civil War, when the International Brigades marched through Madrid straight to the front line, Stalin copied the same idea of having them march straight through Red Square to the front line again, as again a sort of symbolic thing, which was picked up, of course, by the movie cameras and all the rest.
Well, that is not a bad ending, because that's Henry Moore's monument to Hiroshima, which is the sort of bomb that it's really very difficult to shelter from. And a modern one of those, if it were to be exploded, apparently is 100 times bigger. And there are 20 million of them in the world. So, shelters, technology. No one talks about the possibility of one of those going off again. I don't know why. It's almost bound to happen, isn't it?
On that hopeful note, let's go and shelter upstairs. I think we all need a drink in the spirit of the shelters.
Sorry,
a communal sing-song.
It's not. It's not going to happen. It's fine. Don't leave. Don't panic.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our two wonderful speakers, and do join us for a drink upstairs and perhaps a communal sing-song if they feel inclined.